We're ready.
There are plenty of copies of the syllabus. If someone needs a copy, I'll be glad to bring you one.
Good to be with you here at Grace Baptist Church. By showing the Clarence Larkin book, he made me feel quite at home, but at somebody else's home. We don't use that at ours. I've really gotten a warm welcome with his family, and there are a lot of parallels between his family and mine. My wife is named Melissa. His son Atticus has a middle name Paul, which is our son's name, Paul. I have a granddaughter named Lydia. And there were several other things there.
Dr. George?
Oh yeah, we both, he studied under Dr. George, and I played table tennis with him when we were in college. And so there are a lot of ways that we've passed our lives near each other, and so to speak. Now, he mentioned I did pastor Greg Bonson's church for 4 years after Dr. Bonson died. And while I was out there, I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee originally, they noticed my southern accent, and they would kid me about it a little bit. Well, I explained to them that I'm from Tennessee, I speak the King's English, and they don't. They said, how do you figure that? And I said, I'm from Tennessee, where Elvis is from. And you can't argue with the facts. All right, we better get started here. I'll be reading from the New American Standard. What was it you're reading from? New King James? I noticed it was different, so there might be some variations here and there, but I think it'll be understandable. We're here to consider in this series of lectures tonight, these two lectures tonight, the Great Tribulation, which is dealt with in Matthew 24 and other places, but we're going to be looking at Matthew 24. It's found in Jesus' lengthy discourse, which is known as the Olivet Discourse, because he gave it from the Mount of Olives. It's given at the end of his ministry. It's something he has saved toward the end of his ministry. It's something very important. It's given shortly before his crucifixion. He's back in Jerusalem, and in the next few days he will be crucified. It is a very important prophetic passage in Scripture. It's important for all of us, but dispensationalism has a very special place for the Olivet Discourse. In the book by Thomas Ice and Wayne House, they wrote, the Olivet Discourse is the key to Bible prophecy. The key to Bible prophecy. Now, I'm going to be giving you a different view than the dispensational view that he's endorsing, but notice they say this is a key, and I'm going to show you the key does not fit the door to biblical eschatology in the dispensational system. The popular Encyclopedia of Bible Prophecy says, quote, Jesus' longest prophetic sermon and one of the most important prophetic passages in all the Bible. And I agree with them that it is very important. Most Christians will recognize certain elements of the Olivet Discourse. Who's not heard of wars and rumors of wars, the abomination of desolation, great tribulation, false prophets, and all of these features that we just read when we read from Matthew chapter 24 a few moments ago. These are common items in the evangelical church today. You'll recognize that, and you'll hear it in sermons, especially in dispensational churches, in conferences like right here, and in Bible bookstores. You'll find the books all dealing with this. And just recently there was a local secular radio call-in program, very conservative, and the guys that run it happen to be Christians, but it's a secular program. And a caller called in, and they were talking about ISIS over there in the Middle East. And he said, he started quoting from the Great Tribulation passage in Matthew 24. It says, I believe this is coming to pass. And ISIS is the forerunner of the Antichrist and all of this. So you can see how it gets in people's minds today, and they begin interpreting political and social and cultural events in terms of it. Well, the Olivet Discourse is familiar to most Christians, but I believe it's understood poorly by most other Christians. That it's not well understood as it should be, because it's a very important passage and needs to have a good understanding. Most Christians think that we have only recently entered into the last days of history. Very often it will be tagged with the formation of Israel as a nation in 1948. They think that that's the beginning of the last days. J. Dwight Pentecost, a very famous, recently deceased dispensational scholar, he lived to be 100, by the way, wrote of this entire passage, he says, the entire passage in Matthew 24 and 25 was written to answer the question concerning the signs of Messiah's coming, that is the rapture, which would terminate the age. And so dispensationalists see these verses as dealing with the end of the age in which we're living in. before Christ comes to rapture his church out. All dispensational works that you can read today, and there are many of them, will say that Matthew 24 is dealing with the events just prior to the rapture, to the secret coming of Jesus Christ before the Great Tribulation actually begins. So Matthew 24 is going to be dealing with the events that occur right after the rapture, because the Great Tribulation occurs after the rapture. Now, millions of dollars are made by authors who promote this viewpoint. I know because I write an alternative viewpoint, and I've made dozens of dollars. I'm in the wrong market. Well, I want us to consider a few of these popular titles by the Christian prophecy experts, as they call themselves. I'll read a few older ones first, and we'll notice how wrong they were. Then I'll read some more recent ones. Hal Lindsey, 1980s, Countdown to Armageddon. Here it is 35 years later. Hal Lindsey also wrote, Planet Earth 2000, Will Mankind Survive? Yep. That wasn't the answer he anticipated, but here we are 15 years later, we survived 2000. Lester Sumrall, I Predict 2000. David Allen Lewis, Prophecy 2000, Rushing Towards Armageddon. Steve Terrell, the 1990s, Decade of the Apocalypse. And then more recently, you can tell those were written in the 90s. More recently, you have Joel Richardson. In 2009, he wrote The Islamic Antichrist. On the back cover, it says, this book provides a fresh look at Bible prophecy in the light of current affairs with the global rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Another book by T.W. Tram called 2012 to 2015, The Season of Return. That was published in 2013. Chuck Missler has written a book called The Rapture in 2014, and chapter 5 is called His Imminent Return. In other words, they're expecting his imminent rapture soon. David Jeremiah wrote in 2014 a book called Agents of the Apocalypse. On the back cover it says, the stage is set, the curtain is about to rise on Earth's final act. Will you be ready? Carl Gallups wrote a book, 2014, called Final Warning. And in the introduction to that book, it says, startling prophetic questions for our times. He starts right off with those words, startling prophetic questions for our times. Perry Stone has written a book, 2015, this very year, Living in the Final Chapter. The predictions of the ancient prophets are now coming to pass. Well, all of these books lean heavily upon Matthew chapter 24, which we'll be dealing with in two messages tonight. This passage is common in the prophetic discussion of this day. How are we to understand this important passage that Christ taught not long before his death? How are we to understand this crucial discourse that Jesus gave to his church, to us, even today? I want to begin with a basic controlling proposition. I'm going to tell you up front what my view is, and I'm going to make a statement regarding the proposition that I'll be seeking to defend. And then after you get up off the floor, I'm going to demonstrate to you how this is what actually arises from this passage. And it'll take two messages for me to demonstrate this. So, the proposition is this. The Great Tribulation is past. It's over. The Great Tribulation has already passed. That's my proposition. And I'm going to provide 3 lines of evidence. I'll give 2 lines of evidence in the 2 messages tonight. And, in the 2 lines of evidence in this message, and then 1 line of evidence in the next message tonight. The central statement we must analyze, that we must understand, that we must see is actually in the passage, is Matthew 24, verse 21. It says, then there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. That's the Great Tribulation. Jesus, all that he's saying is focusing on that particular prophetic event, the Great Tribulation. And I'm here to say, on my understanding of Scripture, that that Great Tribulation occurred in the 1st century. It's not occurring in our future. And the way I want to demonstrate this is to encourage you to look to the context of Matthew 24 for interpretive cues, interpretive keys. Don't look to the newspapers. Lay aside Time Magazine and USA Today. Read Matthew 24 in its own context and see what Matthew recording the words of Jesus, has to say for you. We must believe the Bible, and I believe the Bible's very clear here. I hope you're like the little girl who was a strong believer in the Bible. She's at school one day, and she's drawing a picture, and the teacher comes up and says, "What are you drawing?" She said, "This is a picture of Jonah getting swallowed by the whale." The teacher said, "Well, you know that didn't happen." The little girl said, "Well, I know it did. It's in the Bible. I believe it." The teacher said, "No, it didn't happen. It couldn't happen. Jonah would have been killed." The little girl said, "When I get to heaven, I'm going to ask Jonah if he got swallowed by the whale." The teacher said, "What are you going to do if Jonah didn't go to heaven?" The little girl said, "Well, then you ask him." So I hope you are Bible believers tonight, and you're going to look at these Bible verses, and you're going to see what Jesus has to say about the Great Tribulation, forgetting what Hal Lindsey and all those folks have to say. Let's see what Jesus says. Let's begin first. The Great Tribulation is tied to the first century. There are three interpretive clues that are extremely important that cannot be overlooked if you want to properly understand Matthew 24. I believe that they clearly and dogmatically link the Great Tribulation to the first century. Let's begin with this first comment. Christ specifically locates the Great Tribulation in history. He locates it in history. It has a particular place in history, and Christ is going to tell us when that is. The Great Tribulation events are set in a clearly defined time in history. Jesus tells us. He does not leave us to our guesswork or our imagination to discern. Look at verse 34. Remember, verse 21 says there will be a great tribulation. Verse 34 says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place." Notice how emphatic Christ is. He says truly. Or if you're King James, it says verily. Truly. Now, Jesus never told a lie. They knew everything he said was true. But when he says truly, he's underscoring the fact, listen to this. This is the truth you need to understand. Then he says, "Truly I say to you." Well, they know he's saying it to them. He is emphasizing the fact. He's telling them, he's calling their attention to this fact he's about to say. "Truly, I am telling you, this generation will not pass away until all these things come to pass." He's talking, remember, to an original first century audience. The Olivet Discourse was a message presented to his first century disciples. And in the immediately preceding passage, he uses that same phrase in the same setting in such a way it must be speaking of the first century events. Look back a few verses to Matthew 23, verse 29. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." Now, do you suspect he's talking to somebody back in the first century? Certainly. We know these characters. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly," here it comes again, "truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling." This phrase, "this generation will not pass away," is used in Matthew 24, and it's found here in Matthew 23, where he's pointing to the historic scribes and Pharisees of that day, and then mentions the Jerusalem and weeps over Jerusalem. We must remember that the generation that Christ was speaking to was a very important generation. Undoubtedly, I would say we would all agree it was the most important generation of history, because they are witnesses to the Son of the living God coming down from heaven and living upon the earth. In that generation in which they lived, Jesus is fulfilling all the typology of the Old Testament, the sacrificial system, the prophetic statements of the Old Testament, and bringing in the finality of redemption. Redemption was put off year by year. Our sins were delayed in terms of judgment year by year through the sacrificial system. But now Jesus comes, and all that the sacrifice is pointed to are there in Him. That's why in Matthew 13:17, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you," here's that truly I say to you, this is something important, "that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it." In other words, they were a particularly important generation that saw the Son of God on earth. Remember, Paul tells us in Galatians 4:4 that Jesus came in the fullness of time. That was an important era that Paul calls the fullness of time. This is why Christ opened His ministry in Mark 1:14 and 15 with these words. "Now after John had been taken into custody, Jesus came into Galilee preaching the gospel of God and saying, 'The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand.'" That generation and those people were truly privileged because the time, the prophetic time, was fulfilled. The kingdom of God was at hand. What a remarkable time. And yet, despite the great privilege and the great time that they lived in, the Jews who should have known the Messiah rejected Him. In John 1:11, John opens his gospel with these words, not the very first words, but very early on. "He came to His own, and His own did not receive Him." The Jews crucified Him. In John 19:15, we read, "They cried out away with him, crucify Him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests, the leaders of Israel, the religious leaders of Israel, the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar. We do not want this man, we want Caesar." And notice in Matthew 24, verse 34, Jesus says, all these things will take place in this generation. And so Jesus is telling that this generation, which was a crucial generation in redemptive history, a crucial generation in world history, because it's the time that witnesses the coming of the Son of God in history. At that time, Jesus says, this generation will not pass until all these things happen. And you can't pick and choose. Jesus says this generation will not pass until all these things happen. And one thing in the Olivet Discourse that's prior to verse 34 is verse 21 that says, "Then there shall be a great tribulation such as has never been." And Jesus says just a few verses later, all these things will happen in this generation. Hence, my proposition, the great tribulation is past. Because I believe that Christ specifically ties it to the first century, the generation in which He was living, the generation that righteous men longed to live to see the things that they saw. But notice this, secondly, Christ specifically relates the Olivet Discourse to the first century temple. Not only does it say it's going to happen to this generation, but He points to that building and says it's going to happen to that building. What prompts the Olivet Discourse? Why does Christ give the Olivet Discourse? The historical setting is important. Jesus is speaking about the temple. In Matthew 23, verses 37 and 38, we read, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Your beloved house, the house of God, the temple, is being left to you desolate." Well, the disciples are amazed, and they respond in chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when His disciples came out to point the temple buildings to Him. He knew the beauty of that temple. They were pointing out the beauty of the stones. In fact, Luke 21 says they mentioned the beauty. they were pointing to this glorious place of the worship of God. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be thrown down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And so Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, declares their house being left desolate. As he walks out, the disciples come and grab him and point to the beautiful temple there and said, "Lord, behold these stones." And Jesus says, "You see all those stones that he could point to? Not one will be left on another that will not be thrown down." And they say, "Well, when will this happen?" Jesus is very clearly tying the events he's about to talk about to that temple that existed in the first century. He is going to be answering their question. And as a matter of historical fact, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70. There has not been a Jewish temple since. That was a dramatic first century event. It's spoken of by Roman historians such as Suetonius and Tacitus, who lived in the first and second century when Christ was here upon the earth. It was engaged by massive battles of 4 Roman legions and many auxiliary forces that came against them. It overlapped, the destruction of the temple overlapped and impacted the Roman civil wars that had Nero die, and the year of the 4 emperors when there was Nero died, and there's Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. In a 1-year period, 4 emperors came and went as Rome was cast into mighty civil war. And right in the heart of all that going on is the Jewish temple being destroyed. And notice this key event is related to the temple. That is related to the temple, the abomination of desolation. Look down the page to verse 15 of Matthew 24. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, when you see this abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, they would witness this abomination in that holy place, the temple." Now I'm going to be explaining the abomination of desolation in the next message tonight, but for now just note that the abomination relates to the first century temple that is no longer with us. Jesus ties this prophecy to that generation, and then he relates that prophecy to that temple which was destroyed in that generation. And then thirdly, Christ specifically applies the events to the Jews. To the first century Jews. Christ specifically ties these events to the first century Jews. Look at verse 16. "Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." Verse 20. "Pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath." Now notice the focus. Judea, where there was a concern for Sabbath. You'll remember all the Sabbath controversies that Jesus had with the scribes and Pharisees that he just called hypocrites. And Jesus is saying, you better hope you don't have to flee on the Sabbath when these events occur. But he's talking to the Jews of the first century. But notice this. He says, flee to the mountains. Let those who are in Judea, that's kind of the county around Jerusalem, flee to the mountains. This is not a worldwide event. This is something that can be fled from. It's something that's localized in Israel, and the Jews can flee to the mountains to escape it. Now, the flow of Matthew is helpful and interesting to understand in this regard, because we're going to see, I mentioned early on, that the Olivet Discourse occurs toward the end of Jesus' ministry. It's in his last week of ministry before he's crucified. It's after the triumphal entry. He's come back to Jerusalem. Now he's giving the Olivet Discourse. And the flow of Matthew leading up to that really looks to that event effectively. We're going to see there are all sorts of hints about the coming destruction of the temple in Matthew, and I won't have time to give them all to you tonight. That's in next year's conference when I come back. All right? Okay. Now, this was a welcome mat, wasn't it? Okay, I figure that's what that's for. Okay, let's notice the flow of Matthew that sets up Matthew 24. Remember, in Matthew 2, Jesus is born, and then we hear all of Jerusalem feared when they heard about this, because Herod, said, where's he that's born King of the Jews, that I may go worship him? And then when he learned that Jesus had been born and they hadn't come back and told him, all of Jerusalem feared. Instead of rejoicing in the coming of Messiah, they fear. Now in Luke's gospel, you remember the shepherds rejoiced and they ran to the city to see this thing. But Matthew is setting the tone of his gospel to lead to this destructive event in Matthew 24. In Matthew 3, that's the third chapter, right after the second one where Christ is born. In Matthew 3, John the Baptist is preaching, and he tells of the Jewish, he's preaching and he tells the Jews of the judgment that is to come. In Matthew 3, he tells of the judgment that is coming. He says the axe is already laid at the root of the trees. And then Jesus opens his ministry in Matthew 4. Where does he open it? Not in Jerusalem, not in Judea, but in Galilee of the Gentiles. There's something happening here. The Messiah of Israel comes and opens his preaching in Galilee of the Gentiles. Very interesting that the Jewish Messiah begins his ministry in Galilee of the Gentiles. His first major discourse is the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5, he talks about how Israel has corrupted the law. In Matthew 6 and 7, he calls them hypocritical in one way after another. And then in Matthew 8, he heals a Gentile, and what does he tell those around? In Matthew 8:10, he says, I have not found such a great faith with anyone in Israel. All this negative thought patterns against the Jews. And then in Matthew 8:12, he says, the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness, whereas the Gentiles will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of God. But the sons of the kingdom, the Jews, the ones you would have expected to rejoice in the kingdom, they're going to be cast out. Well, I'll have to skip ahead for time constraints here. Matthew 21, verse 43. Jesus, after giving a parable, says, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you and given to a nation that will bear the fruit of it. I think you will recognize that passage there. Matthew 22, verse 7. After another parable, he says the king sends his armies to destroy the city with fire. And that's in that prophecy, he's talking about the coming destruction of Jerusalem by fire. And then in Matthew 23, which we read from a few moments ago, he gives those 7 woes upon the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Therefore, one purpose of Matthew, it's not the only purpose, but one purpose of Matthew is to sketch the dismal spiritual condition of Israel and the expectation of their coming judgment as their temple's about to be destroyed. Clearly, the Olivet Discourse is tied to the first century, to these stones, to this generation, and it fits in that book perfectly. Now, my second major point tonight is this. The first century facts fit the prophecy. How can we understand these various elements? I want to survey a few. Now, I've already shown that Jesus says it'll happen in this generation, it'll happen to that temple with those stones, and it all fits the flow of Matthew. But now we're going to look at the prophecies themselves. Remember, Matthew 24, verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so they specifically asked him, having heard him say, your house is being left desolate, the blood will come upon you, from the blood of righteous Abel to Zechariah. It'll all come upon you. They want to know, when is this going to happen? And of course, you've already heard, he says all these things will happen to this generation. But he gives them signs whereby they can anticipate it. And these elements will support the proposition that the Great Tribulation was in the first century. And so we're going to survey these signs. Notice first the false Christ and prophets. In verses 4, 5, and 11, we've got to save time by skipping a few verses, 4, 5, and 11. Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. Verse 11, many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. These are signs. Jesus says Don't let anyone mislead you. It's coming in this generation. You'll be witnessing this event eventually, but don't let anyone mislead you about anything, because they're going to be false prophets. Well, the danger Jesus warned about was false religious leaders, some of them even claiming to be the Christ, and we see this anticipated in the New Testament. For instance, in Acts 5:36, we read, "Some time ago Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a group of about 400 men joined up with him." This Theudas rose up among the Jews and claimed to be somebody special, and 400 people went with him. Acts 8, verses 9 and 11. "Now there was a man named Simon who formerly was practicing magic in the city and astonishing the people of Samaria, claiming to be someone great. And they all, from the smallest to them, were giving attention to him, saying, 'This man is called the great power of God.' And they were giving him attention because he had for a long time astonished them with his magic arts." We're seeing some of this anticipation of these false religious leaders. Paul said regarding the Ephesians, you remember just before he left the church at Ephesus, he called the elders together in Acts 20. And he weeps with them because he might see their face no more. But in Acts 20, verse 30, he says, "From among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them." And so here we have another anticipation of someone drawing these people away. John warns of the Antichrist. Now the Antichrist, anti in Greek means instead of. The Antichrist. 1 John 2, 18 and 19. Notice what John says. "Children, it is the last hour, and just as you heard the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they were not really of us. For if they had been of us, they would have remained with us, but they went out so that it would be shown that they are all not of us." So this Antichrist, this movement, this idea of something replacing Christ, the instead of Christ movement, is already back there in the first century. Now, very interestingly, in the Jewish war itself, the Jewish war erupted in AD 67. In the year 67, the temple was destroyed in 70. It's interesting that, for instance, Philip Schaff, one of the great church historians, says, quote, "Israel rose to the most insolent political and religious fanaticism and was continually inflamed by false prophets and messiahs. One of them, according to Josephus, drew after him 30,000 men." Well, Josephus was a first century Jewish historian who lived during the destruction of the temple. In fact, he fought on both sides of the battle. He first fought for Israel, defending the city Jotapata, but when he was defeated, he gave a prophecy that Vespasian would become the emperor one day, and this endeared him to Vespasian, and so Vespasian used him to go out in front of the troops and try to call upon the people on the city walls to put down their arms and to give up, that Rome was going to defeat them. So he's considered their Benedict Arnold. He fought on both sides of the Jewish war, for the Jews, and then he also was with the armies that defeated the Jews. Well, notice what he writes in his book, Antiquities of the Jews, 28:6. "Now these impostors and deceivers persuaded the multitude to follow them into the wilderness, and pretended that they would exhibit manifest wonders and signs that should be performed by the providence of God. And many that were prevailed on by them suffered the punishments of their folly. For Felix brought them back and then punished them. Moreover, there came out of Egypt about this time to Jerusalem one that said he was a prophet, and advised the multitude of the common people to go along with him to the Mount of Olives, and he would show them hence how at his command the walls of Jerusalem would fall down." You see, Jesus warns about these false religious leaders. And sure enough, we see expectations of them in the New Testament record, but in Josephus' historical account, we see people doing this very thing in the context of the Jewish war that led to the destruction of the temple. Well, what about the wars and rumors of wars? This is a popular sign in current literature, the rising of ISIS and all that's going over there in the Middle East. People are quoting this wars and rumors of wars stuff. Matthew 24, verses 6 and 7. "You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for these things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." Well, the problem arises, how can this be a sign? How can war be a sign that is significant? How can it be a sign of anything? Which wars? It sounds very nebulous. When we look around, we see wars going on all the time. Well, no. In the first century, this was a sign of great significance because the first century was experiencing what is called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Since the days of Emperor Augustus, remember Jesus was born under Augustus, who sent out a decree that all the world should be taxed or enrolled under him. Well, this is called the Augustan peace. Now, Origen, a church father who died in the year 254, speaks of, quote, the abundance of peace that began at the birth of Christ under Augustus. Epictetus, who died at 130 AD, said, Caesar has obtained for us a profound peace. There are neither wars nor battles. However, we're going to see that the Jewish war erupts, and that will be an interruption of the Pax Romana. Philip Schaff, again, the church historian, says, in the Roman Empire proper, the period of peace remained comparatively undisturbed until the time of Nero. And Nero was the emperor that commissioned Vespasian to go in and to destroy, put down the Jewish revolt and destroy the temple. But the Jewish war, which erupts in AD 67, has an empire of nations come against Israel. You see, Rome was an empire. It wasn't one nation like America. It was an empire of nations that were brought under the sway of one city, Rome. And they had these various kings from Rome, from Syria, from Arabia, and other places that joined with them. Nation is rising against nation to come against Israel. And also, nation is rising against nation within the Roman Civil War. There was a revolt. Germany tried to break away from the Roman Empire during this time. Gaul, which is France, also sought to break away. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote in his histories, 1-2. Now listen, this is Tacitus, a Roman historian. He wrote about 125 or 130 AD. I am entering on the history of a period rich in disasters, frightful in its wars, torn by civil strife, and even in peace full of horrors. 4 emperors perished by the sword. That's the year of the 4 emperors, AD 69, by the way. 4 emperors perished by the sword. There were 3 civil wars. There were more with foreign enemies. There were often wars that had both characters at once. Nation is rising against nation, all in the context of the wars and rumors of wars, despite the fact the general character of that time was the Augustan peace, this great imperial peace that was imposed upon the Mediterranean basin. And so when the Jews, when his disciples begin hearing these signs of this revolt and that revolt, they are to get out of Dodge because they know Jesus has warned, when you see this Augustan peace breaking down, flee to the mountains. C, earthquakes and famines. Matthew 24:7b says, there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Well, these are easy to document in the time period before AD 70, even in the Bible. In Acts 11:28, one of them, Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. That was after Augustus, Tiberius, and then there was Claudius. And so, in Acts 11, there's this great famine that affects all the world. Of course, that means the world of the Roman Empire, the world of their day. And the famine was particularly cruel in Jerusalem during the actual Jewish war. In fact, it was one of the worst aspects of the Jewish war. In Acts 11:28, I'm looking back up my notes, not down, having deja vu all over again. Josephus says, quote, I almost said Atticus, from the Antiquities of the Jews, not from Atticus, from the Antiquities of the Jews, 22:5. A famine did oppress them at that time, and many people died for want of what was necessary to procure food withal. The reason Israel is suffering such, or Jerusalem in particular is suffering such famine, is because they're in the city fighting among themselves. And they have a store of corn that is said to would have covered a 25-year period. It would have lasted 25 years. There was so much of it stored. But they were fighting themselves, and they burned it up. And then they start starving. Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio Cassius, Eusebius, and Orosius all speak of famines during this time period. Not during our time period today. During the time period of this generation, while that temple was still standing, in that Augustan peace, there were famines. Tacitus writes regarding the year 51, and this is not directly related to the Jewish war, but it's in the general time frame. This year witnessed many prodigies. Further portents were seen in the shortage of corn, resulting in famine. It was estimated that there was no more than 15 days' supply of food in the city of Rome. And pestilence always follows famines. When people are dying from famine, then pestilence and disease follows. And sure enough, Josephus tells us in his Jewish wars that there was pestilence that was besieging Jerusalem. Excuse me. Of Nero's reign, Nero is the one who declared the war with Israel. Suetonius says, in a single autumn, 30,000 deaths from plague were registered at the temple of Libetania. He says that in his book called Nero, that's paragraph 39. And there were also quakes in that time. Acts 16:26 says, suddenly there was a great earthquake so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened. And even during the Jewish war, not only leading up to it as one of the signs anticipating, but right in the Jewish war, we read this from Josephus in Jewish Wars 4:4-5. There broke out a prodigious storm in the night with the utmost violence and very strong winds, with the largest showers of rain and continual lightnings, terrible thunderings and amazing concussions, and bellowings of the earth that was in an earthquake. And so right there in Jerusalem, during the Jewish war, there was this huge earthquake. Tacitus talks about earthquakes in Crete, Rome, Apamea, Phrygia, Campania, and Laodicea. And so we see these events, earthquakes and famines, occurring in the first century context. We don't need to look to them to our day for them. Notice also persecution and apostasy. These signs are also ordained by Christ. Matthew 24, verses 9 and 10. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. Persecution occurred in the first century. In the New Testament even. With all the other indicators, we're going to see that this fits. Why should we look anywhere else to find when these signs are going to occur? They fit right in the first century, even occurring in the New Testament itself and then right after the New Testament. Acts 8:1. Saul was consenting to Stephen's death. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. A great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem. Jesus warned that you will be persecuted. Paul speaks of persecution and apostasy. Now, Jesus says, you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. Well, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 14 through 16, you also suffered the same things from your own countrymen, just as they did from the Jews, who killed both the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us. And they do not please God, and are contrary to all men, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles, that they might be saved, so as always to fill up the measure of their sins, but wrath has come upon them to the uttermost. And then later in 2 Timothy 1:5, he talks about his betrayal. This you know, that all those in Asia have turned away from me, among whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. See, he's telling that Christians are apostatizing and turning against one another. 2 Timothy 4:10, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Verse 16, at my first offense no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them. And the epistle to the Hebrews is a major response to the apostasy going on in the first century church. And we have those famous warning sections in Hebrews. For instance, Hebrews 10, 32 and 33. Remember the former days when after being enlightened you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. So we see that Hebrews, well, actually the whole story of Hebrews is encouraging those Jews who profess faith in Christ not to apostatize back into Judaism. And they were beginning to leave. And the writer of Hebrews is calling them back, saying, remember, you were persecuted before, but come back into the church. And so, this first message tonight has sought to demonstrate the proposition that the Great Tribulation is past. And I believe it's clearly been substantiated thus far. Jesus ties it to this generation that's hearing him. He ties it to the temple, which is no longer with us since that generation passed. And all these events so far we've seen actually occur. The wars and rumors of wars during the age of the Pax Romana. This famine and persecution and this apostasy and betrayal, all these things are happening in that century. The Great Tribulation is a past event. Thank you. Do we have question and answer now? Or I don't even know what time it is. My watch is broken. Y'all don't go by Christian Standard Time here, do you? Okay, good. All right. Do you have any questions you might want to ask at this stage? You might want to save them till later. Who knows? All right. Hearing none, we'll let them stand approved as read. You can tell I'm Presbyterian, can't you? All right, we'll take a little break here.
Take about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. I can always tell when I'm speaking somewhere if there are dispensationalists in the crowd, because when I come back after the first break, they're all gone. I guess they're acting out the rapture for me. But I think what they're really doing is saying, we thought you were going to tell us who the Antichrist was. All right, we're ready for our second message on the Great Tribulation. We're returning to our analysis of Matthew chapter 24. But remember, as we get started, verse 34 is fundamentally important. Jesus says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. He is talking about that generation, the generation that was so significant throughout all the book of Matthew. Remember, there were men who wanted to see what you see and they don't see it. That generation, they're asking about that temple and those stones, when they will be destroyed. They ask a question about the destruction of those stones in that temple, and Jesus is giving them the answer to that. And we know that temple was destroyed in the year 70, so it did happen in that generation. We noted also that the wars and rumors of wars fit. We noticed that the persecution fit, famines fit, apostasy, all these things have fit. But so far, that's the easy stuff. We've got some tough things coming up. Difficulties remain. I'm going to study these seriatim, and I want to study them in the form of 7 questions. These are objections that are usually brought against this AD 70 view, which is called preterism. Preterism means past. It's from the Latin word preteritus, which means passed by, and it means something that is past already. Preterist approach to prophecy is recognizing that some prophecies have already passed and been fulfilled. And those are such as this one in Matthew 24, where it says it'll happen in this generation. That's why we know that it's past. But some questions remain. Let's look at these questions. Let's consider the first one. Was the gospel preached in all the world? Was the gospel preached in all the world? That's what we want to ask. Chapter 24, verse 14 says, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, I have already said that all things in this passage up to verse 34 is going to take place in this generation. But here Jesus says, the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world to all the nations, then the end will come. This is a very popular objection against the preterist viewpoint. It seems quite formidable. House and Ice, Wayne House and Thomas Ice say this, quote, if we look closely at Matthew 24:14, we notice that there are 2 phrases which modify shall be preached, in the whole world and to all the nations. In the first phrase, the adjective whole indicates that it is the world in its totality that is in view. Are they saying, he's talking about people that hold my view, are they saying that the gospel was preached before AD 70 in the Western Hemisphere? Well, how can we answer such a question? It seems to be a potent objection, doesn't it? But beauty's only skin deep and ugly's to the bone. We're going to see this is an ugly argument. It's not going to work at all. And I think once I get through it, you'll say, yes, I see what you're talking about. We'll start off with something more general and get to something more specifically. I'm going to argue that the word world does not mean the whole globe, the whole world, earth that we live on, but it means the Roman Empire. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. Luke 2:1. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Would House and Ice ask Luke, did this mean that the Romans sent out a decree to register the Western Hemisphere? Well, to ask it is, you're already laughing at it. Very clearly, it doesn't mean that. Acts 24, verse 5. We have the Jews that have brought Paul on trial here. He says, we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Was Paul stirring up Jews over here in the Western Hemisphere? No. It's throughout the Roman world. We must also notice that this is clearly fulfilled in the New Testament. Now consider this. Romans 1:8. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that notice he was a southerner for y'all, for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Would Ice and House ask whether the faith of the Romans was spread throughout the whole world? The testimony of the Romans was heard throughout the world? No. It says the same language. The whole world is here. By the way, I keep referring to House and Ice. Just kind of a side note here, it's a historical interest thing. House and Ice wrote their book against this view that I'm presenting and some other things. And later, Dr. House, Wayne House, said he regretted having written the book. It was not done well, and he apologized to me for it. In fact, I saw him when I spoke at Criswell College in 2013. He was one of the speakers there, and I was a speaker. And he said, you know, I regret we ever did that book. It was not well done, and I apologize. He's a real nice fellow. Of course, the other guy's a nice fellow too, but Dr. House recognized the arguments weren't what they should have been. Well, consider Colossians 1, verses 6 and 23. The gospel has come to you as it has also in all the world, and is bringing forth fruit as it is also among you since the day you heard and knew the grace of God in truth. And listen to verse 23. If indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven. That sounds universal, doesn't it? But it's not. It's like we might say, my world's collapsing. That doesn't mean people will start to run and hide. Oh no, I live in the same world they do. The whole thing's falling apart. No, it's to be understood in this context. The Bible says the gospel was preached in the whole world. It says that the testimony of the Romans was heard throughout the whole world. That obviously is speaking of the Roman world. It is not speaking universally of the whole globe on which we live, the earth. Therefore, Matthew 24, verse 14, has been fulfilled. The gospel was a witness to all the nations in the whole world in the way that it's spoken of in Scripture. Secondly, what and where was the abomination of desolation? The abomination of desolation. Verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Now, the popular conception is that this abomination of desolation has something to do with the Antichrist in a rebuilt temple. And this is the abomination of desolation in the future great tribulation, in their view. Well, again, we must interpret this contextually, according to the literary context and the historical temporal context. We have to look at the passage and understand it the way it was written, the way it was uttered at first, and then written in the first century. And this must have occurred in the first century for several reasons. Notice the contextual evidence. Capital A, the contextual evidence. A temple was standing in a holy place. A temple was standing in a holy place at that time. Matthew 27:53 tells us about the temple in the holy city. His audience could imagine no other referent. When Jesus is talking about this abomination happening, standing in the holy place, and he's sitting at the foot of the Mount of Olives, in view of the temple, his disciples could have thought of no other more holy place than the temple of God. And he's definitely talking about that holy temple in that holy city. Notice also, Christ states this regarding observations on that very temple. Observations on that very temple. Again, verse 24, verse 1. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. He's talking about that temple. And a Jew would say the holy place is what? That temple. All through the Old Testament, even into the New Testament, the temple is the holy place. It's the house of God. Thirdly, Christ points to that very temple in reply. He points to that very temple in reply. When they pointed out the temple buildings, he points back to that temple and says, see you not all these things? Do you not see all these things? All these stones that you're pointing to me. You see them all? And then it declares, truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. You're looking at the temple, the beautiful, majestic temple of God. Not one stone here is going to be left on another that will not be thrown down. This beautiful, large temple is going to be destroyed. He's telling them. And this abomination of desolation that stands in the holy place must have something to do with the holy place where the temple is. Fourthly, Josephus similarly describes the temple's destruction. In other words, he uses some language that has to do with desolation when he talks about the temple. Now, Josephus uses the verb form that Jesus uses a noun for. Jesus says aramathe, which means desolation, the abomination of desolation. Well, Josephus uses the verb form of that when he talks about the temple, and he says in Jewish War 6:10:1, thus was Jerusalem taken. This was the second time of its desolation. There's that word again. Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation. When Josephus is writing about the destruction of the temple, he calls it a desolation. Also, he applies Daniel's prophecy to this. In Antiquities of the Jews 10:11:7, Josephus says, in the very same manner, Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government and that our country should be made desolate by them. This desolation keeps occurring in Josephus, and it was already there in Jesus. And then fifthly, remember, the statement is controlled by the specific time frame. The statement here is controlled by the specific time frame. How many girls in here are left-handed? There's one right before me. There's one right there. I see you. The last three Gentry, male Gentrys born in my family are left-handed. My youngest son and my two grandsons, they're taking over. You know, left-handed people, you can't even tell them from other people sometimes. Giving these girls a hard time. But I'll have to introduce you to my boys. All right. The statement is controlled by the specific time referent. Matthew 24:34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass till all these things take place. He says in verse 15 something about an abomination of desolation in the holy place. The holy place is the temple. The abomination of desolation is an event. And he says all these things will take place in this generation. Now, consider the historical meaning, capital B, the historical meaning. What is the abomination of desolation? The desolation of the holy city and temple by the Romans is what's being referred to here. It's helpful to look at Luke 21, verse 20. Now remember, Luke is a Gentile. Matthew is a Jew. Matthew speaks in a Hebraic way and uses Hebraic terminology. Well, Luke, when he records what Jesus says, he's going to rephrase it in terms of something that Gentiles could understand. And so this phrase, the abomination of desolation from Daniel, Luke is going to rephrase, and notice what he says. Luke 21:20. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. You see, he takes the abomination of desolation and rephrases it to the Roman armies surrounding the temple and the city and desolating it. Now the Romans circled the city 3 times before it was finally destroyed. Cestius, don't worry about this, not going to give a pop quiz. Cestius Gallus was a Roman general and procurator in the area. He came down to put down the Jewish revolt in the early stages of it, but he failed and retreated back. And then Nero heard of this, so Nero had to commission Vespasian to come down. Vespasian circles it and is about ready to destroy it when Nero is killed in the Roman civil wars, so Vespasian has to go back to Rome to fight and end up becoming the emperor. So then he sends his son Titus back, and Titus surrounds it for the 3rd time and then finally destroys it. Titus determined that the Romans, quote, and I'm going to be reading this from Jewish War 5:12, Numbers 1 through 3. Titus determined that the Romans must build a wall around the whole city, and when Titus therefore had encompassed the city with this wall and put garrisons into proper places. He went around the wall at the first watch of the night, so all hope of escaping was now cut off from the Jews, together with their liberty of going out of the city. So on the third circling of the city, the third wall built around it, they're trapped. So it's obviously going to have to be that the Christians, when they see the army surrounding Jerusalem, that must have been when Cestius Gallus surrounded it. Cestius Gallus failed and went back, and then Nero had to send others in to do the job. So Jesus says, when you see this happening, flee to Judea, or flee Judea to the mountains. And as a matter of fact, they do that. We have historical records that they did that. But what's interesting is, keep in mind, Matthew, citing Daniel, a very Jewish book, calls it abomination of desolation. Luke writes the same prophecy, but he rephrases it so Gentiles can understand what's going on. It's when the Roman army surround the city to desolate it. The holy place is going to be desolate, is what's being taught here. Now, leading up to that era, there's an internal struggle within Jerusalem. And the abomination of desolation well sums up not only what the Romans do, but what the Jews themselves are doing to their temple. In Jewish War 4:5-1, Josephus says, "The outer temple was all of it overflowed with blood, and that day as it came on saw 8,500 dead bodies there." That's because the Jews, while the Romans have them surrounded, the Jews are engaged in civil war, and they're parted into three factions. That'll become relevant in the book of Revelation when we talk about that tomorrow. But they're fighting among themselves, and they're killing themselves, and the temple has blood flowing down it. The temple of God, which was to be kept pure and holy and undefiled, now has the bodies of dead men in it and blood flowing all down its steps. And the Jews themselves are causing this. The Jewish zealots cause great harm within. Jewish War 5:1-2 says, "The temple was defiled everywhere with murders." Excuse me. The temple was defiled everywhere with murders. And then he tells us in 5:1-3, "They went out over the buildings and the temple itself and fell upon the priests and those that were at their sacred offices." Now think of this. The holy place, abomination of desolation. The priests are in there conducting their holy rituals, and the zealots come in there and kill the priests, and their blood is now flowing mingled with the sacrificial offerings. This is an abomination of desolation that is leading up to the Romans circling the city and coming in and doing something even more abominable. Let's read about that. Titus commits the final act of abomination in the temple, because what happens is the Roman soldiers come into the temple, they put their ensigns with the eagle on it, SPQR, the Senate and population of Rome, which was worshipped by the Roman legions. They came in and put their ensigns up against the temple, and they bowed down and worshiped the Roman Empire in the place where God was to be worshipped. Let's hear what Josephus says, Jewish War 6:6-1. "The Romans, upon the flight of the seditious into the city, and upon the burning of the holy house itself, and of all the buildings lying round about it, brought their ensigns to the temple, and set them over against the eastern gate. And there they did offer sacrifices to them, and there did they make Titus imperator with the greatest acclamations of joy." Where God was to be worshipped, Rome was to be worshipped. Where God was to be praised, Titus was being praised. That is the abomination of desolation. The temple where the worship of God was to be conducted is now the place where the Roman pagan worship is happening. Clearly, the AD 70 events are very relevant to the original audience. The Jews who had denied Christ are now reaping what they sowed. Remember, they said, "His blood be upon us and our children." This is what is happening in AD 70. And it eventuates in this abomination of desolation after the Roman armies surround it and then come in and offer pagan worship there. Thirdly, was the Jewish war the worst ever? Was it the worst ever? Verse 21 says, "Then there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be." Well, this is one of those tough questions that arises. Was AD 70 the worst war of all times? This is a major complaint against it. Charles Feinberg has written, when he compares AD 70 to World War I and World War II, he says, who can legitimately equate them with Matthew 24:21? He's saying what we have here is the World War II and World War I. Well, surely they were worse than the Jewish war, and you can't even compare the two, he would say. John Walvoord says of the Great Tribulation, it's a time of unprecedented trial. It is a time of unprecedented trouble, a trial that would exceed any judgment of the past or the future. In fact, never in the history of the world has there been the destruction of human life described here. What is more, the trials and difficulties of that day would be so severe that it would exterminate the entire race, human race, if it were not for the fact that they were cut short because of the return of Christ. Well, how are we going to respond? If we say the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century, right there in the text where it says the Great Tribulation occurs, it says it's the worst tribulation of all history. How can we respond? Well, here's the answer. First, the context demands it. Verse 34 says all these things will happen to this generation. To me, that should settle it, because it does say, after that event, it does say all these things, as if he's looking back over everything he's just said. All these things I just told you will happen in this generation. But notice also the context rebuts the modern argument. The context rebuts the modern argument. John Walvoord is absolutely wrong when he says the Great Tribulation, which I believe is AD 70, will exceed any judgment of the past or the future. He says, let's look at it in his terms first. And I'm going to go back and explain some things I just said. In the Great Tribulation, according to dispensationalism, 1/3 of the world population dies. You probably have heard that figure before if you've heard some of this dispensational teaching. 1/3 of the world population dies. That would be worse than AD 70, wouldn't it? Maybe 1 million Jews died. How are we going to explain that? If there's a Great Tribulation in our future, 1/3 of the world dies, they've got their 1/3 of the world, and all we have is the 1 million Jews in the first century. How can I defend my view on this basis? Again, context. Because he says, Jesus says, this is the Great Tribulation, the worst ever, and the dispensationalists say that 1/3 of the world dies. Well, look in the context, verse 38 and 39. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. Guess how many in the world died in the Noahic flood? Every single person except for Noah's family, 8 people. Now, which is worse, 1/3 of the world or the entire world? This is talking about not only so, but it takes out all the animals, all the air-breathing animals except the ones on the ark. Something else is going on here in this text. Let's consider the literary style supports it. The literary style supports it, that is, supports my view here. And so what I'm saying is, when the dispensationalist says, look off to the future, there's a great tribulation coming where 1/3 of the world dies, nothing like that's ever happened. I said, well, yes, it did. In the days of Noah, the entire world except for one family died. And so that doesn't even compare to that. Let's notice the literary style. The major problem, though, is that modern Christians are unfamiliar with Old Testament language. The Old Testament prophetic language is often hyperbolic. Consider this. Matthew 24:21 says there will never be another time like this. Exodus 11:6, talking about the 10th plague. Then there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor ever shall be like it again. Well, if the future Great Tribulation is to be the worst ever, and there will never be anything like it before or after, what about the 10th plague? He says they'll cry out as something that's never like that happened before or after. Ezekiel 5:9. I will do among you what I've never done, and the like of which I will never do again because of all your abominations. He destroyed the temple in the Old Testament, and it was rebuilt in the New Testament. And then it was destroyed again. See, the language, God has the language of the Babylonian destruction of the temple in this hyperbolic language. I will never do anything like this again. But then he does in the New Testament. Now let's notice this. Now that you might try to worm your way out of it. I'm not going to let you. Look what happens here. Do I have these texts in your notes there, 2 Kings? Look at this. 2 Kings 18:5, talking about Hezekiah. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those that were before him. Would you say he's the best king ever and nobody could compare? Well, look at the same thing said about Josiah in 2 Kings 23:25, the same book. Before him there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul, with all his might, according to the law of Moses. Nor did any like him arise after him. Well, which one's the best king? In both places, in the same book, they say of Hezekiah and of Josiah, the best ever. Nobody before or after could be any better. This is hyperbolic language. It's not a lie. It's a language of exaltation. It's simply saying, this is a good king. But as a matter of fact, there is coming another good king. And so what we have to understand is the Bible sometimes speaks with hyperbole, with exaggeration, for dramatic effect. It's not a literal statement that you can quantify mathematically necessarily. Fourthly, did Christ come like lightning? Verse 27. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Again, you have to read this contextually. Notice what he's speaking about and the connection. Look at the preceding verse, verse 26. If they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner room, do not believe them. And so here in verse 27, Jesus is going to dismiss these false expectations. He's saying, don't listen to these people. Notice, he says, my coming will be unmistakable. For, verse 27, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Don't believe people when they say he's here or there. You'll know it, because when I come again, it's going to be like a lightning bolt. And so that's what he's saying there. Okay? All right? Now we come to another toughie. Number 5, did the stars fall? Verse 29, did the stars fall? Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. John Walvoord says, the great dispensational scholar, there will be other unusual phenomena occurring in connection with the second coming of Christ. He says the second coming will be preceded by many supernatural events in the skies. And he cites Matthew 24:29 here. These supernatural events, the stars falling from the sky. Notice that he says the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. How do we explain this? A meteor shower? Solar eclipse? Or what? Again, this is dramatic, apocalyptic Old Testament language. It's dramatic hyperbole, and I can demonstrate it. In Isaiah 13, I believe I have this in your notes there for you. Isaiah 13, verses 10 through 13, we read this. See how similar this prophecy sounds to Matthew 24. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. There's the same language. The sun will be darkened. There's that language, and it's going forth. And the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a mortal more rare than fine gold, a man more than the golden wedge of Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place, and the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. What is he talking about? Well, look at verse 1. The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. This is a prophecy against Old Testament Babylon. And then notice verse 17. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. In verse 19, in Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Now think of this. In verses 10 through 13, the stars are falling, the sun's not shining, the moon's not shining, the earth is shaking out of her place. But he says, and also you got to worry about the Medes and Persians. No. Why would anybody be worried about the Medes if this is happening in the stellar universe? You don't worry about some army coming. They've got to worry about the stars collapsing on them, don't they, the Medes? This is dramatic, hyperbolic language. It's speaking of the collapse of a civilization. Now remember, in Genesis 1:14, God set the sun and the moon in the sky to govern the day and night. So in Scripture, the sun and moon are symbols of government. Like in our flag, we've got 50 stars that represent the 50 state governments. I mean, that's held widely throughout history, but it's in the Bible too as well. Well, what's happening is the stars falling represents the collapse of the government. Their world is falling apart as their government leaders are destroyed, as their nation falls apart. That's what this is symbolizing. The same thing is true for Edom. Look at Isaiah 34, verses 3 through 5. Their slain shall be thrown out. Their stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. Now, do you think the mountains are really going to be melted with blood? No, this is hyperbolic, dramatic, poetic language. There is not going to be enough people in the world with enough blood to melt the mountains. And then it says, all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls of the vine. All their hosts. Is he saying literally that all the stars of the universe will fall down to the earth? And then he says, for my sword shall be bathed in heaven, indeed it shall come down on Edom. Once again, Isaiah 13 was talking about Babylon and the collapse of their government. Isaiah 34 is Edom and the collapse of their government. And so this is hyperbolic language speaking of the collapse of a government. The sign of a star is a symbol of government. Remember, the star shall rise out of Jesse. It's talking about David, the son of David, going to rise to be the ultimate ruler. Sixthly, our sixth question, how did Christ come in the clouds? Now, I was asked this a few moments ago in the break, so we'll get to that now. I think this is the one we were talking about. The Olivet, actually, it was the preceding one that you asked about. I've already dealt with it, so you can go back to sleep. His eyes were flying at half-mast anyway. Just kidding. The Olivet Discourse is a judgment on Jerusalem. How will they see the Son of Man coming in the sky? Well, the King James Version, Matthew 24:30, I actually like better, says, then there will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Note well, it first says, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. It doesn't say, then will appear the Son of Man, but then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, which means to say, he's not in the tomb over there outside of Jerusalem. The sign of the judgment of the temple is the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. He is resurrected and ascended into heaven. He is not there in the tomb. That's what he's saying in the first part of this verse. But then it goes on to say, then you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Again, this is apocalyptic language, judgment language, strong language. And it has a parallel with this. Now notice what Jesus says to the high priest, Matthew 26:64. Jesus said to him, it is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Excuse me. He's talking directly to the high priest. He's on trial for his life there, and he looks the high priest in the eye and says, nevertheless, I tell you, you will see the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven coming excuse me, in power. What is going on here is this is another symbolic, apocalyptic, poetic language event. The clouds are symbols of judgment. Have you ever had a tornado down here in this area? When you have. Apparently I brought up something we should not talk about. Well, when you see those dark clouds coming, that's scary. And so a cloud is a symbol of judgment. And Jesus is going to be judging the temple, and he's saying the clouds of God's judgment are coming through me, the Son of Man. For instance, in Lamentations 2:1, we have these words, how the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. He didn't really cover them with a cloud, but it's the judgment concept that he's speaking about. Ezekiel 30, verse 3, the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. It will be like a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. Ezekiel 30, verse 18, in Tehaphnehes, the day will be dark when I break the yoke bars of Egypt. Then the pride of her power will cease in her, a cloud will cover her, and her daughters will go into captivity. He's not really saying it's going to be a cloudy day that day. You're not going to get much good sun. He's giving an image. This judgment cloud, when you see here in Alabama, the dark clouds forming something that could issue forth in a tornado, it's a bad sign. Well, likewise, he's saying a judgment coming is against you. A cloud judgment is coming against you. Ezekiel 38, verse 9 of Gog, it says, you will go up, you will come like a storm, you will be like a cloud covering the land, you and your troops. See, he's telling the armies of Gog are going to be like a cloud covering the land. The Roman armies coming into Jerusalem are effectively a cloud of judgment coming upon the land. Joel 2, verses 1 and 2 says basically the same thing. And a very similar passage to Matthew 24, verse 30 is found in Isaiah 19:1. Isaiah 19:1 says, the oracle concerning Egypt, this is in the Old Testament, the oracle concerning Egypt, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt, and the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within him. Now let me ask you, did God in the Old Testament literally get on a cloud and ride down into Egypt and knock over their idols? No. This is judgment language. This is poetic, dramatic, hyperbolic language that speaks of great devastation. And just like a storm cloud comes, he's saying, God is in that cloud. God is going to destroy you. In fact, Matthew 24, verse 30, cites Daniel 7:13. But notice what Daniel 7:13 is talking about. Daniel 7:13 says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days. The coming of the Son of Man is the coming up to heaven to receive power and glory, and because he is in heaven, the sign is that the Son of Man is in heaven. Because he's in heaven, he's bringing this judgment upon Israel for rejecting him. So, again, we're seeing that this is symbolic, poetic, dramatic language because of the way it's used throughout Scripture, because of what these symbols represent by themselves, but when they're clustered together like this in judgment passages, we can feel the power of what is being talked about. So then, what is the sign that the Son of Man is at the right hand of God? The sign is the destruction of the temple. The high priest of the temple judged Jesus and destroyed him, and he is the temple. He said, in 3 days, you destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up. He is the true temple. They destroyed that temple, and Jesus destroyed their temple. And the sign is that the Son of Man is in heaven. The one that you destroyed is in heaven while you're here upon the earth, and he's destroying your temple. That's really effectively what's going on. Now notice the whole reason for the Olivet Discourse, again, verses 2 and 3, he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And then 4 verses after Matthew 24, verse 30, 4 verses later, he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. And so again, we see how it fits. Seventh question and final question. What is the gathering of the elect? Matthew 24:31 says, He will send forth His angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together His elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. This seems to refer to the second advent, the angels, the trumpet, the gathering, and this language can fit literally to the second advent. I do believe Jesus is coming. He will come in great glory. He will gather us up to be with Him. But AD 70 is kind of a small picture of the second coming. It's a distant adumbration, it's called. It is a day of the Lord in history that is a small picture of what is coming at the end of history. But we're looking at this judgment here in AD 70. What is going on here? I want to make two important notations as we begin. The first is this. 3 verses later, he says, all these things will happen to this generation. Never forget that. How could you? I've mentioned it so much you're sick of it. Secondly, the lexical point here. The word angel in the Greek is angelos, which simply means messenger. It can mean the angelic messenger of God, Gabriel, Michael, whatever. But it can speak of human messengers, as it does in Matthew 11:10, Mark 1:2, Luke 7:24. For instance, Luke 7, verses 20 and 24. When the men came to him, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, are you the expected one, or do we look for someone else? When the messengers, the angeloi, angels, when the messengers of John had left, he began to speak to the crowds about John. And so you see, the word angel can mean messenger. So then, how do we explain this verse? When he sends his messengers with the great trumpet, what's going on? Well, you're probably getting the suspicion here that I'm talking about gospel ministers will go out into all the world with the message of the gospel. But what's the trumpet have to do with it? Well, the trumpet is picked up from the year of Jubilee in the Old Testament, in Leviticus 25. The ram's horn was sounded. In Leviticus 25, verses 9 and 10, we read these words. You shall then sound a ram's horn. By the way, this is the same in the Greek version of the Old Testament. It's the same word as in the Greek New Testament. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement you shall sound a horn throughout all the land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. The year of Jubilee was a time when all the debts of Israel were forgiven. Every 50th year it was to happen. All debts forgiven. That is a type, a symbol of our debt being forgiven in Jesus Christ. And so this trumpet sounding is a picture of the sounding of the ultimate Jubilee. It's the trumpeting forth of the gospel of Jesus Christ to declare true salvation through Him. Interestingly, Isaiah 61 picks up on Leviticus 25, the year of Jubilee. And Jesus reads from Isaiah 61 when he's in Luke 4:19 in the synagogue. And he says, He is there to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. This is that language from the year of Jubilee, which is the favorable year of the Lord. Jesus says in the synagogue there in Nazareth, while he's standing up reading from the scroll of Isaiah, he's quoting from that passage which refers to the year of Jubilee, and he's saying he is there to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. He has brought in salvation. As Christianity is freed from Judaism in the first century, it goes out to all the world and proclaims the forgiveness of debt to God. And so what's happening here is an image of the gospel preachers being sent out into all the world under the year of Jubilee imagery, the declaration of forgiveness of sins in Jesus Christ. The gathering of the elect is simply the gathering of a new body. No longer are the true believers to be gathered into Israel. They're to be gathered into the church, the ecclesia of God. Hebrews 10:25 says of the church that we're not to forsake the gathering of ourselves together. And this church here has been gathered. You have been gathered by the work of the gospel. And at the collapse of Israel, at the collapse of the temple in Jerusalem, the church is free to go out into all the world. It had already started before then, of course, but now it's totally free from all constraints. Paul and the Christians don't have to go back to the temple do all this, that, and the other with the temple. And they go out into all the world to gather in the elect from the four winds, from all over the earth, from one end of heaven to the other. That is, as you look west, you'll see the sunset over there. You look east, you'll see the sun rise over there. The heaven touches there, and it touches there. From one end of heaven to the other is being covered. In other words, everywhere in the world. And so the angelic witness speaks of gospel messengers going out and declaring the great jubilee of God. We don't use that language hardly ever today, but the fact is, if we were to look at the year of Jubilee in the Old Testament and recognize it's a picture of the coming salvation of Jesus Christ's work on the cross, then we could use that language effectively to declare the Jubilee of God in Jesus Christ. And we go out throughout all the world, leaving Jerusalem and Israel behind, and one race. No longer just one race, one city, one temple. We go out into all the world, to all nations. I believe a powerful case can be made for the proposition that the Great Tribulation is past. I believe it's quite biblical, quite historical, quite contextual, and quite reasonable. And you can get a detailed exposition of that in two books over there, the Olivet Discourse Made Easy, and then the other one I debate them in, Thomas Ice, in the Great Tribulation, Past or Future. He writes his view, I write mine, and we interact with each other. And I've been quoting him several times during this talk tonight. Anyway, that is why I believe the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century, because Jesus tied it to the temple, because he said it happened in this generation, because there were wars and rumors of wars and persecution and famine and sword and apostasy, and because the gospel was preached as a witness in all the world of that day, and all of these other things. It all fits. And it's all under the umbrella. All these things must happen to this generation. I really don't see any way around it. Let's open up for questions if you have any. Yes?
I had heard that, one thought that the writings of Josephus may have questionable reliability and that they were perhaps forged by the Catholic Church. How do you answer that?
The question is, were the writings of Josephus forged by the Roman Catholic Church? That is, I don't know of any reputable antiquity scholar that teaches that. That may be a theological debate somewhere, but you can buy books on Josephus today and you'll find that they very deeply study it. In fact, I've got a lexicon or two-volume lexicon in my library. It's a lexicon based on the Greek of Josephus. What probably is happening, either you've got the story mixed up or somebody has gotten the story mixed up. There is one phrase or one section in Josephus where it calls Jesus a righteous man and talks about him in laudatory terms, our Jesus. And some have said that the Roman Catholic Church put that in there. That may be what you're referring to, that one section there, the 3 or 4 sentences, there is a debate as to whether that's original with Josephus. And there are actually secular scholars that say it is. But that is a debate. That might be what you've heard, or it might be what the person who told you what he said had heard. So if that's the case, if that little section was put in there by Christians later, well, then drop that out. But the whole rest of Josephus remains, and that is only less than a paragraph. But that's a good question. Shows you've been thinking about these things and hearing information on this. Interesting. Yes?
You referred to Matthew 24 mostly. Did you ever, just out of curiosity, did you find anything, a tidbit of information, anything in Mark 13?
Oh, yes. Mark 13 is the parallel to Matthew 24, and Luke 21 also. Yes, there's much. I couldn't go to all 3 of them because it'd just be too much. And Matthew's setting is particularly significant because, in my understanding, there tends to be a tendency in Matthew to show something's going to be happening to the Jews. When Jesus is born in chapter 2, all Jerusalem fears. Chapter 3, John the Baptist preaches, the axe is laid to the root of the tree. Chapter 4, Jesus begins preaching in Galilee of the Gentile. All the way through there, why is all this going on? And then at the end of the book, the temple's going to be destroyed. And you can see that it fits a flow of thought in Matthew. Yeah, but yes, you're right. Mark 13, generally scholars feel that Mark was written before Matthew. And Mark 13 tells the same thing. Luke 21 does it a little differently because he's writing for Gentiles. It's a little mixed up in there separately.
Do you think that because, I mean, wasn't Matthew mostly writing to the Jews?
Yes, he was writing a very Jewish gospel. There are many evidences in there that it's written for Jewish people. In fact, it starts right off with the genealogy of Christ going all the way back to Abraham, but Luke's goes all the way back to Adam, because Luke is writing for Gentiles, and Matthew's writing for Jews. Yes, you're right. Good. I like to hear people have been thinking and recognizing distinction between the Gospels and such. Yes? Or somebody else? All right. Well, okay. I don't know what we're doing now. By the way, I didn't finish this water if anybody needs it.
We're going to put it back for tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for coming out. We're going to start tomorrow morning. We probably need to start on time around 9 o'clock. Dr. Gentry's going to do, you're going to do